March 1945. Western Germany is already bruised by collapse, yet the war has a way of hiding its sharpest teeth in ordinary places. An American armored column steel tracks, exhaust haze, radios chattering in clipped phrases rolls toward a river crossing that exists on maps, in plans, in the assumptions of momentum. But when the lead vehicles crest the approach, the crossing is not there. The bridge is a broken skeleton, girders bent like ribs, decking torn away, the far bank framed by ruined masonry and blackened trees. The column stops not because it has met an army, but because it has met absence. The river itself is not wide. It is the kind of water that might be dismissed in peacetime, a narrow ribbon cutting through low ground, cold and fast, swollen with March melt. Yet in war, width is not measured in yards. It is measured in what must cross it. Tanks do not swim. Fuel trucks do not float. A river that can be stepped over by a farmer can still stop an entire mechanized spearhead if the bridge is gone. And when the spearhead halts, the whole thrust behind it compresses like a muscle held in tension, burning energy while accomplishing nothing. Under sporadic enemy fire, engineers move forward with notebooks, rangefinders, and the grim arithmetic of combat. They do not speak in slogans. They speak in hours. How long to locate a suitable site? How long to clear the approaches? How long to build a treadway, bridge, or ferry equipment across? In March 1945 hours are not neutral units of time. They are currency spent in blood. A delay means the enemy can dig in, move guns, blow the next crossing, mine the roads, reposition reserves. Every hour becomes a quiet multiplication of future casualties. Hundreds, perhaps more, paid out later by men who will never know why the column paused here. The Germans in this sector are retreating, but retreat does not mean surrender. It means choosing the ground on which to slow the pursuit. The riverbank offers them exactly what a collapsing force needs: a natural line, a narrow funnel, a place where a few weapons can command a wide approach. Terrain is still a kind of ownership. Even a defeated army can make the landscape speak for it. On the far side, machine guns and artillery observers do not need to hold forever. They only need to hold long enough to turn speed into hesitation. The battlefield is defined not by grand vistas, but by immediate sensations: smoke hanging low, the sting of cold air in lungs, the slap and churn of water against debris. Broken steel juts from the near bank, slick with mud, while shattered planks drift and spin like reminders of what used to be reliable. Men hug the ground behind embankments and craters, listening for the flat crack of rifle fire and the heavier punctuation of artillery. Somewhere, upstream or down, the river keeps moving. Indifferent. It has no allegiance. It simply does what it has always done: run, and that is precisely what makes it so dangerous. Commanders on the near bank face a choice that is older than the machines parked behind them. They can wait, call for bridging units, bring up smoke generators, coordinate fires, assemble a careful crossing. Or they can improvise under fire, forcing a passage with whatever can be built, floated, or stolen from the wreckage in front of them. Waiting feels responsible. Improvisation feels reckless. But war has a way of punishing the option that seems safest on paper, because paper does not bleed and does not freeze in a river. For a moment, the war pauses at the water's edge. Engines idle. Orders are weighed. Men look at the far bank and then at the river between, as if the distance might change if stared at long enough. Time, which had been on their side as the front rolled forward, begins to shift its loyalty. It starts working against them quietly, relentlessly, while somewhere beyond the smoke and the broken girders, the enemy prepares to turn a missing bridge into a killing ground. Not far from the stalled crossing, the war produces one of its smaller, quieter collisions. A brief skirmish breaks out along a hedgerow road, rifle fire, sharp and sudden, then quickly over. When it ends, a handful of German soldiers emerge with their hands raised, boots sinking into the wet earth. They are cold, exhausted, and no longer running. The advance has caught them in the open, and now they stand in the margin between enemy lines, unsure which side of the war they belong to anymore. Among them is a man who carries no visible authority. His uniform is unremarkable, his posture careful. He is not infantry by training, not a gunner or an officer. He is an engineer taught to calculate loads, angles, stresses, taught to think in spans and supports rather than fields of fire. War has given him a rifle, but it has not erased what he knows. As he is searched and separated, his eyes move past the Americans, holding him and toward the river. where machines idle and men argue with the ground. From where he stands, the problem is obvious. He recognizes the current, the slope of the banks, the way the soil has been undercut by winter water. He understands why the bridge failed and what would be required to replace it, even temporarily. He watches American soldiers test the mud with their boots, watches vehicles bog and strain, and sees not confusion, but unfamiliarity. This terrain is speaking a language he knows well. And knowledge, in war, can be as dangerous as a weapon. His uniform marks him as the enemy. By doctrine, that should be enough. The laws of war are clear. Prisoners are to be secured, questioned, moved away from the fighting. Cooperation is not their role. Expertise does not change allegiance. Yet the river does not recognize uniforms or doctrine. It responds only to physics, to weight and force and flow. Steel will either hold or it will not. Men will either cross or they will remain exposed on the bank. As the prisoner is marched closer to the rear, he glances once more at the crossing. He says nothing. He does not offer advice. But the possibility hangs there, unspoken, like smoke that refuses to disperse. On the American side, officers scan maps and timetables, calculating delays they can no longer afford. On the German side, a man who was trained to build rather than destroy knows the answer to a question no one is supposed to ask him. Doctrine forbids it. Law complicates it. Morality weighs heavily against it. And yet, in the churn of mud and water, a quiet idea begins to take shape, fragile, improper, and potentially decisive. Because the river does not care who built the bridge before, it only waits to see who will dare to build the next one. Intelligence reports arrive in fragments, carried by radio static and hurried runners. German units, though battered, are not dissolving into the countryside as hoped. Upstream, they are regrouping, pulling men and guns towards secondary lines, searching for places where a pause in the American advance can be turned into resistance. The river is no longer just an obstacle. It is a signal flare. Every hour spent here tells the enemy exactly where to aim their response. Time, in this phase of the war, is measured with a new severity. Delays are not neutral intervals between actions. They are invitations. An idle armored column is vulnerable, compressed along roads and embankments, waiting for a bridge that does not yet exist. Artillery can be walked in. Counterattacks can be organized. What should have been a rolling pursuit risks becoming a static fight, and static fights are where momentum dies. The calendar says March 1945. The war is supposed to be ending, but endings, too, can be prolonged by hesitation. American engineers work quickly, but they are working blind. The soil along the banks is unfamiliar, winter softened, layered in ways no field manual can fully predict. There are no local load tables, no precise schematics of the destroyed structure, no clear understanding of why it failed when it did. Temporary bridges demand exactness. The right anchoring, the right span, the right distribution of weight. A small miscalculation does not merely delay a crossing, it collapses it, often with men still on it. The bridge that once stood here was not improvised. It was built deliberately by German engineers for German traffic with German materials and assumptions. Its design reflected local knowledge, how the river swelled, how the banks shifted, where stress accumulated in flood season. And now that bridge lies broken, not as a mystery, but as a lesson written in twisted steel, a lesson the Americans cannot fully read. One man can. The prisoner, held just beyond the immediate chaos, understands why the structure failed and where its weaknesses were meant to be. He knows which supports were sacrificial, which were reinforced, and which could never carry the weight of armor for long. His knowledge is precise, practical, and dangerous. In another context, it would be invaluable. In this one, it is forbidden. Commanders gather over maps and watches, arguing in low voices. Protocol is clear. So is the situation. Survival, speed, and mission success are pulling against rules written for cleaner circumstances. No training exercise has prepared them for this moment, where the war's outcome, at least here, at this river, may hinge on whether doctrine can bend without breaking. And as the hours continue to pass, the question sharpens. Which will prove more costly, violating the rules or obeying them too faithfully? Before the war reduced him to a prisoner standing in the mud, the German engineer had been trained for permanence. His education had been methodical, technical, and ideological in equal measure. He was taught to think in decades rather than days, to design structures that would endure load, weather, and time itself. Efficiency was not merely a technical goal, it was a moral one. Order, correctly imposed, was believed to be its own form of victory. In pre-war Germany, engineering carried a particular weight. Bridges, roads, and factories were not seen as neutral utilities, but as expressions of national will. To build was to control. A bridge did more than span a river. It fixed movement into predictable channels. It asserted dominance over terrain, and it made power visible in steel and concrete. Improvisation was something done by those without resources. Proper planning, it was believed, removed the need for it entirely. This philosophy followed German engineers into uniform. They were trained to construct infrastructure that would serve a Reich imagined to last 1,000 years, not to create temporary solutions under fire. Their bridges were designed to carry columns of armor with precision and reliability. They were measured, reinforced, and documented. When destruction came, it was deliberate. Charges were placed where they would do the most damage, ensuring that what had been built could not easily be repaired or repurposed by an advancing enemy. The logic was simple and confident. Destroy the crossings, deny momentum. Force the enemy to stop, to bunch up, to expose himself. Time, in this calculation, would favor the defender. Even in retreat, German doctrine assumed that resistance would take familiar forms: fire, delay, demolition. The idea that a captured engineer might become an asset to the enemy was not seriously considered. Cooperation did not fit the model. It belonged to a different kind of war. The bridge at this river had been designed with those assumptions in mind. Its failure was meant to be final, its destruction a closing door. Every twisted girder was intended as a statement. You will not pass quickly here. That Americans now stood on the near bank, considering ways across, was expected. That they might look to German knowledge to do it was not. Yet war has a way of stripping beliefs down to their weakest joints. The engineer, watching from captivity, begins to understand that the skills meant to secure control can be turned into instruments of surrender. The bridge he helped create, meant to channel German strength and then deny it to others, has instead created a moment of uncertainty where allegiance blurs. What was designed to stop an army now threatens to help it move again. The assumption that destruction would always serve resistance begins to unravel, not in theory, but in practice. The war has reached a point where permanence is less valuable than speed, and order less useful than adaptation. And as American commanders weigh an unthinkable option, the engineer realizes that everything he was trained for may soon be used in a way he was never meant to imagine on the other side of the river, for the other side of the war. The American army had been built on systems, and its engineers were among the most systematized soldiers in uniform. From training grounds in the United States to battlefields across Europe, they were taught that every problem had a prescribed solution. Rivers were crossed with Bailey bridges. Soft ground was tamed with mats and corduroy roads. Loads were calculated, stresses anticipated, tolerances defined. Nothing was left to improvisation if a manual already existed. This faith in procedure had been earned. Standardization allowed an army of millions to move, fight, and supply itself across continents. A Bailey bridge could be erected quickly, often under fire, using components shipped halfway around the world. Pontoon systems turned rivers into temporary roads. Doctrine reduced chaos into sequences of steps, and steps into results. When conditions matched expectations, the system worked with remarkable efficiency. But doctrine assumes predictability. It assumes terrain that behaves within known limits, rivers that follow familiar patterns, soil that responds as it did during training. At this crossing, those assumptions begin to erode. The river's banks slump under weight. The current undercuts temporary anchoring. Vehicles bog where calculations say they should not. The manuals offer answers, but none of them quite fit the question being asked by the landscape. Commanders sense the mismatch immediately, even if they cannot yet name it. Standard solutions will take time to bring up bridging units, time to prepare sites, time to protect construction under fire. Each delay adds pressure to a front that was supposed to be moving, not pausing. Yet procedure exerts its own gravity. It promises safety through familiarity, and in war, familiarity feels like control. When the idea of using enemy knowledge is raised quietly, Cautiously, it meets instinctive resistance. Trusting the enemy violates more than rules. It violates habit. War teaches suspicion as a survival skill. Information is weaponized. Deception is expected. To rely on a captured German engineer feels not merely improper, but dangerous. Trust, in this environment, is treated as a liability that can get men killed. And yet, failure carries its own weight. Every unsuccessful attempt to adapt doctrine to unsuitable conditions risks collapse of equipment, of morale, of momentum. A bridge that fails under load is worse than no bridge at all. It wastes time, exposes men, and confirms the enemy's calculations. The longer the Americans insist on solving this problem alone, the more the river asserts its indifference to their procedures. American engineers are not inflexible by nature. They are problem solvers. But their confidence rests in systems proven across thousands of miles and countless engagements. To step outside those systems is to accept uncertainty, and uncertainty is the one variable doctrine is designed to eliminate. The manuals do not account for this situation because they were never meant to. They assume the enemy resists with fire, not insight. As daylight fades and reports continue to arrive from upstream, the calculation shifts. The question is no longer whether procedure is sound, it is whether it is sufficient. At this river, adherence to doctrine promises correctness, but not speed. And speed, now, may matter more than correctness. Somewhere between the manuals and the mud, American faith in procedure begins to strain, as commanders confront a truth no training field ever fully taught them, that sometimes the greatest risk is refusing to take one. The moment arrives without ceremony. There is no dramatic confrontation, no raised voices. Through an interpreter standing ankle-deep in mud, the German engineer speaks carefully, choosing words that cannot be mistaken for persuasion. He does not argue. He offers. What he has, he explains, is knowledge, nothing more. What the Americans choose to do with it is their decision. He begins with the river itself. Beneath the surface, he says, the bed is layered, a skin of silt over compacted gravel, then softer clay that shifts under sustained weight. The current scours at the outer bank and deposits along the inner bend, creating uneven load points invisible from above. He gestures toward the remains of the destroyed bridge and explains where stress accumulated, where the failure was inevitable once the charges were placed. It is not a lecture. It is a diagnosis. He speaks next of American equipment, not with contempt, but with precision. Certain bridging components, he predicts, will sink before they anchor. Vehicles will stall where the soil liquefies under repeated passes. A temporary span built too close to the original abutments will twist under asymmetric load. These are not guesses. They are conclusions drawn from familiarity with the river, with the materials, with the way structures behave when theory meets water. When he finishes, no one responds immediately. The silence that follows is heavy, crowded with competing instincts. Disbelief sits beside suspicion. Officers exchange looks that ask questions they cannot voice. If he is wrong, they risk delay. If he is lying, they risk catastrophe. If he is right, they risk something harder to measure. The erosion of a boundary that war insists must remain firm. His motive is impossible to read. Survival is the simplest explanation, but not the only one. Exhaustion plays its part. So might conscience, or professional pride, or the quiet compulsion of a man trained to solve problems when he sees one being mishandled. War has stripped him of certainty, of nation, of future. What remains is knowledge, and the decision of whether to use it. The offer has no precedent in their manuals. Cooperation with the enemy under fire is not a procedure that can be referenced or reviewed, yet the situation itself defies precedent. This river has already overturned assumptions on both sides. It has reduced doctrine to suggestion and belief to burden. The war here has narrowed to a single question: how to get across before time closes the window entirely. Commanders confer in low voices, weighing risk against risk. Guards are ordered closer. Conditions are set. The engineer will speak only through interpreters. He will not approach equipment unescorted. His guidance will be advisory, not authoritative. Control, they insist, must remain American. It is a compromise shaped by necessity rather than comfort. When the decision is made, it is not announced. It is simply acted upon. The engineer is brought closer to the riverbank, still under guard, still a prisoner. The first questions are asked cautiously, precisely, and as the conversation begins, the war crosses an invisible line away from certainty and into improvisation, where success will depend not on who built the bridge before, but on who understands why it fell. Work begins under a peculiar geometry of trust and threat. Rifles remain trained on the man giving instructions, their barrels steady, their presence unmistakable. The German engineer does not touch tools. He points, he explains, he waits. Guards stand close enough to hear every word, close enough to intervene if intention drifts from instruction. This is not cooperation born of goodwill. It is cooperation enforced by circumstance, balanced on discipline and suspicion. The first task is measurement, and even this reveals the depth of the problem. German standards differ subtly from American ones. Assumptions about load margins, about how much stress a structure should endure before failure is expected rather than prevented. The engineer insists on recalculations, on adjusting spans by feet rather than inches, on shifting anchor points away from where doctrine suggests they should be. American engineers listen, skeptical but attentive, pencils moving as numbers are crossed out and rewritten. What emerges is not a replacement of American design, but an adaptation of it. Bailey Bridge components are repositioned. Pontoon elements are reassigned to roles they were not originally intended to fill. The structure begins to reflect two schools of thought forced into uneasy alignment. American modular efficiency reshaped by German familiarity with this specific river. Innovation here is not invention. It is translation. As construction advances, the river asserts itself exactly as predicted. Sections of bank slump when weight is applied too quickly. Temporary supports sink where calculations once said they would hold. The water's surface remains deceptively calm, but beneath it, the current pulls and scours, undermining the work with quiet persistence. Each warning given by the prisoner, each adjustment made in response, reinforces a pattern that is impossible to ignore. Then comes the collapse. A temporary segment, placed too early in the sequence, gives way with a suddenness that leaves no time for reaction. Steel drops, water surges, and 3 men are knocked from their footing into the churn below. Shouts cut through the noise of the river as ropes are thrown, and hands reach down. The men are pulled free, shaken, soaked, alive. The failure is violent, but contained. It could have been worse, much worse. Silence follows not the stunned quiet of shock, but the heavy pause of recognition. The engineer had warned against that exact placement. The warning had been noted, then set aside in favor of speed. The river had answered the mistake without argument. No one speaks of blame. The lesson is clear enough without words. From that moment, the tone shifts. Questions come more quickly. Answers are weighed more carefully. Trust does not bloom. It accumulates, layer by layer, each one earned by accuracy rather than reassurance. The engineer's instructions are followed, not because he is believed, but because he has been right. In war, correctness carries its own authority. American engineers begin to adjust instinctively, thinking less in terms of what the manual prescribes and more in terms of what the river demands. They stagger loads. They delay certain placements. They reinforce areas that would normally be considered sufficient. The work slows, but it also stabilizes. Progress becomes incremental, cautious, deliberate. Speed is no longer the only measure of success. The bridge begins to take shape not as a triumph of design, but as a negotiation with reality. Each section added is tested, watched, and retested. Vehicles edge forward and pull back. Weight is applied gradually, almost respectfully. The structure responds, flexing but holding. What was once an abstract plan becomes a physical presence. Steel spanning water, possibility replacing delay. All the while, the engineer remains under guard, his role unchanged, his status unresolved. He is neither ally nor saboteur, neither redeemed nor condemned. He exists in a narrow space between function and fate, defined solely by the usefulness of what he knows. Around him, American soldiers work with a focus sharpened by proximity to failure. The river is no longer an enemy to be overcome, but a force to be understood. As the final segments are aligned and secured, the bridge no longer looks temporary. It looks intentional. It holds its line against the current, its angles corrected, Its supports reinforced where experience, not doctrine, dictated. Men paused to study it, not with pride, but with calculation. The real test has yet to come. Because building a bridge is only the first act. What matters is whether it can carry the weight of what the war demands next. And as engines begin to idle closer to the crossing, and the first armored vehicles are positioned for the approach, the question lingers in the cold air above the river. Will this fragile alliance hold when steel and momentum finally commit to crossing it? As the work settles into its rhythm, something subtle changes along the riverbank. During brief pauses, while a section is aligned, while weight is tested, while orders are relayed, conversation begins to replace command. Not the loud exchanges of officers directing men, but quieter words passed between individuals standing close together, waiting for the next task. The war does not stop, but it loosens its grip just enough to allow voices to emerge beneath it. Cigarettes are shared without ceremony. No one announces the gesture, and no one acknowledges its meaning aloud. A hand reaches into a pocket. A pack appears. One is offered. One is taken. Smoke drifts low over the water, mingling with the mist rising from the river. For a few minutes, the men are not advancing or retreating. They are simply standing in the cold, breathing, watching steel settle into place. The German engineer speaks when spoken to, and sometimes when he is not. He does not talk about the Reich, or duty, or victory promised and lost. He talks about home, about a town reduced to coordinates on a map, about a wife he has not heard from in months, about a child who would now be old enough to remember his face. His words are factual, restrained, offered without appeal. They are not confessions. They are inventory. The Americans answer in kind. They do not speak of hatred or triumph. They speak of distance, of farms left behind, of factories that once seemed permanent, of the simple desire for the war to end so that movement can finally reverse direction. Their voices carry no illusions. They know the fighting is nearly done, but not finished. The last miles, they understand, are often the most dangerous. No one forgets who is who. Rifles remain slung and ready. Guards do not step away. The engineer is still a prisoner, his status unchanged, his future uncertain. The Americans are still soldiers in an enemy country, alert to every sound from the far bank. The boundaries remain clearly drawn. And yet, within them, roles begin to blur, not officially, not legally, but humanly. The work becomes the priority, eclipsing questions of allegiance. Steel does not care who tightens the bolt, only that it is tightened correctly. The river does not respond to slogans, only to weight and balance. As each segment is secured, attention narrows further. Hands move automatically. Voices drop. The bridge is no longer an experiment. It is a responsibility. In these moments, the war recedes into background noise, not gone, but muffled. Artillery thuds far off, distant enough to feel abstract. Radios crackle with updates that sound less urgent here than they should. The immediate world contracts to the width of the river, the line of the bridge, the cold beneath boots. Survival is measured not in victory, but in stability. For the German engineer, this truce is not absolution. He understands that clearly. When the bridge is finished, his usefulness may end. The same knowledge that has kept him alive may no longer protect him. He works anyway, because the work itself demands completion, because half-built structures fail, because unfinished spans collapse. For the Americans, the moment is equally fragile. Trust has not replaced caution. It has merely been suspended in favor of function. They do not delude themselves into thinking this cooperation changes the war's moral shape. It does not erase what has been done, or what remains to be done. But it does complicate the story they will later tell themselves about who the enemy was and what it meant to defeat him. As the last major sections are set and secured, men step back and study the bridge in silence. It holds. The river flows beneath it, narrowed and redirected, no longer blocking the way forward. The human truce has done its work, quietly, without ceremony. Already, it is beginning to dissolve, its purpose nearly fulfilled. Because the war has not ended, the bridge must still be crossed. And once the first vehicles roll onto it, once weight, speed, and momentum test, what cooperation has built there will be no room left for conversation, only proof. The reports arrive with increasing urgency. Enemy units, once scattered and disorganized, are now moving with intent toward the river. Scouts describe columns shifting position, artillery being unlimbered, command elements reappearing where only hours before there had been silence. What was assumed to be a collapsing rear guard is beginning to cohere. The pause at the crossing has been noticed. Far off, beyond the curve of the hills, artillery can be heard. At first, it is indistinct, a low, distant thump that might be mistaken for thunder. Then, it settles into rhythm. The sound does not mean shells are falling here yet, but it means guns are in range, and range changes quickly. Time, which had been borrowed cautiously during construction, is now being reclaimed by the enemy. The bridge stands complete enough to invite use, but not yet proven. Steel spans water. Supports bite into soil. On paper, it should hold. But paper calculations do not hear artillery, and they do not account for what happens when urgency replaces patience. The order comes down. The bridge must be lowered, tested immediately. Armor is waiting. The advance cannot afford another pause. American engineers prepare according to procedure. The test will be gradual light vehicles first, then heavier loads, building confidence step by step. It is the method that has worked countless times before. The structure has been reinforced beyond minimum standard. The margins look acceptable. Under normal circumstances, this would be enough. The German engineer intervenes. He does not raise his voice. He does not argue doctrine. He points to a specific section near the center span, where current presses hardest against a support that appears solid but rests on compromised ground. He explains that under static weight it will hold, but under repeated stress, especially from tracked vehicles, it will begin to shift. Not immediately, subtly, and once it moves, correction will be impossible. His insistence is uncomfortable. It contradicts American calculations, which show adequate tolerance. To reinforce now would mean delay hours, perhaps. Hours they do not have. Artillery is already repositioning. The sound in the distance is closer than it was before. The commanders face a decision stripped of abstraction. They can trust their numbers and proceed, accepting the risk. Or they can accept the warning and reinforce, sacrificing speed for stability. The choice is no longer about protocol versus improvisation. It is about which form of confidence is more dangerous, the confidence of experience or the confidence of familiarity. They choose to listen. Orders are given to halt the test. Additional supports are rushed into place. Materials are diverted. Men work with renewed urgency, driven not by optimism, but by fear sharpened into focus. The river resists, as it always has, but the adjustments change the structure's behavior. Weight is redistributed. Stress is redirected. The bridge settles differently now, more reluctantly, as if acknowledging the terms imposed upon it. Minutes stretch. The sound of artillery grows louder. Reports confirm enemy elements closing the distance. There is no guarantee the reinforcement will be enough. There is only the certainty that without it, failure would be immediate and catastrophic. When the test resumes, it begins again with light vehicles. Tires roll slowly onto the span. Steel flexes. Men watch for signs of shift, for changes too small to announce themselves loudly. None appear. Heavier vehicles follow, their engines low and steady. The bridge responds as predicted, strained, but stable. Finally, armor approaches. A tank moves forward, its tracks clanking onto the bridge with deliberate slowness. Every vibration carries consequence now. The added reinforcement holds. The suspect support absorbs the load without drifting. The structure does not protest. It endures. What might have collapsed under haste now survives scrutiny. What might have failed unseen now holds under the weight it was built to bear. The decision to pause when speed was demanded has altered the outcome. There is no celebration. Relief, here, is quiet. The enemy is still approaching. The crossing still lies ahead. But the bridge, reinforced against time as much as against water, has bought something invaluable: the ability to move without fear of sudden ruin. The turning point does not arrive with fanfare. It arrives with the absence of disaster. And as the first armored vehicles prepare to cross in earnest, one truth settles over the riverbank with undeniable clarity. Listening, in this moment, has proven stronger than certainty. Because now the bridge stands not as a compromise, not as an experiment, but as the only thing separating momentum from disaster, and the war is about to test it fully. The first vehicle chosen to cross is deliberately small. An American Jeep rolls forward, its engine idling low, almost apologetic in the quiet that has settled over the riverbank. This is not symbolism. It is caution. The Jeep's weight is known, predictable, forgiving. If the bridge is going to protest, this is where it will begin. The driver eases onto the span. Steel responds with a subtle flex, the kind expected, the kind designed for. The sound is not alarming, but it is unmistakable, a low creak, a shift of mass acknowledging gravity. Men watch from both banks, eyes fixed on joints and supports rather than the vehicle itself. The river slides beneath, unchanged, uninterested. The Jeep reaches the midpoint. For a moment, it pauses not because it must, but because everyone else needs it to. The structure settles, redistributing the load exactly as the calculations predicted after reinforcement. No support drifts, no angle sharpens. The bridge holds its line. The Jeep continues and reaches the far bank. It stops there, intact, unremarkable, suddenly insignificant. The test is not ended, but it has begun to answer the question that has dominated every decision since the crossing was destroyed. Will this bridge carry the war forward, or will it fail at the moment of commitment? Behind the Jeep, tanks wait. They line up in silence, engines rumbling, exhaust drifting low in the cold air. These are not abstract loads on a chart. They are steel and momentum, weight measured in tons, vibrations amplified by tracks. Once they move, there will be no gentle testing, no retreat without consequence. Armor does not edge forward tentatively. It commits. The German engineer stands under guard, watching with an expression that reveals nothing. He does not smile. He does not brace. His eyes move instinctively to the place he knows best, the reinforced support near the center span, the point that once threatened failure. He understands precisely what will happen there when weight arrives. He knows how close this structure is to its limits, and how far it has been pulled back from them. The order is given. The first tank advances. Its tracks clatter onto the bridge, the sound sharper, heavier than the Jeep's passage. The structure responds immediately, flexing deeper now, bearing weight it was never originally designed to hold here. Men hold their breath without realizing it. Radios fall silent. The distant artillery fades into irrelevance. At the center span, the reinforced support absorbs the load. Stress travels through steel and timber, redirected where it must go. The bridge bends, but it does not betray itself. The tank moves forward, slow and deliberate, each meter a confirmation. It reaches the far bank. A second tank follows, then a third. The rhythm establishes itself, mechanical and unstoppable. What was hesitation becomes flow. Vehicles cross not as experiments, but as part of an advance that has found its footing again. The bridge ceases to be an object of fear and becomes an instrument. The German engineer watches every crossing, not as a participant, but as a witness. This is the moment he has been calculating towards since he spoke through the interpreter. This is where all assumptions are tested at once. The bridge does not fail where he once expected it to. The reinforcement has done its work. The river has been answered on its own terms. For the Americans, the relief is palpable but restrained. There is no cheering, no celebration. The war has trained them not to waste emotion on success that can still turn. They move vehicles across with increasing confidence, spacing them carefully, maintaining discipline. Momentum returns, not as a rush, but as a controlled release. The advance resumes. Armor spreads out on the far bank, engines revving, formations reassembling with practiced efficiency. Infantry follows, boots clattering across steel that now feels solid beneath them. The crossing that once threatened to halt an army has become a passage, narrow but sufficient. The enemy's calculation that this river would buy time has failed. Behind the advance, the bridge remains crowded with movement. Trucks, guns, fuel carriers all cross in turn. Each successful passage compounds the decision that made it possible. The war's direction here has been altered not by firepower, but by restraint. The German engineer remains behind, still under guard, his role diminishing with every vehicle that clears the span. His usefulness has peaked and is already fading. He understands that too. The bridge no longer needs explanation. It speaks for itself now. As the last vehicles of the initial wave cross and the sound of engines shifts decisively to the far side, the riverbank empties. What was once a place of argument, doubt, and uneasy cooperation becomes just another rear position. The war moves on, indifferent to how narrowly it avoided delay or disaster here. The bridge stands, scarred by use but unbroken. It has carried more than weight. It has carried a moment where belief gave way to listening, where certainty yielded to humility, and where an enemy's knowledge became the means of advance. And as the armored column disappears down the road beyond the far bank, one truth settles quietly over the crossing. The river has been defeated not by force, but by understanding. The artillery opens fire as if summoned by motion. The first shells land beyond the river, then walk closer, each impact a measured correction. German gunners, alerted by sound and movement, have finally found their target. The bridge, still crowded with vehicles and men, is no longer merely a structure, it is a coordinate. Explosions rise in dark columns of earth and water, throwing spray high into the cold air. One shell lands short, another long. The distance between them narrows. Shrapnel hisses across the river's surface, tearing through mist and smoke. The bridge itself remains untouched, but only by meters. Near enough that men flinch. Near enough that steel rings with each concussive thud. The natural instinct is withdrawal. Under artillery, the safest place is anywhere else. But retreat is no longer possible, not without catastrophe. Vehicles are already on the span. Others are committed to the far bank. To abandon the bridge now would mean chaos. Blocked approaches, stranded armor, exposed infantry. The crossing has passed the point of reversibility. It must hold, or everything collapses with it. Engineers refuse to leave their positions. Some crouch beneath the bridge, checking supports even as shells fall nearby. Others remain on the approaches, guiding traffic, enforcing spacing, controlling speed. Their work has shifted from construction to preservation. Every successful crossing now matters more than the last. The bridge is no longer being tested, it is being trusted. The German engineer remains where he has been, unprotected, except by proximity. Guards shouted him to move back, but he shakes his head, pointing instead to the structure as it absorbs shock waves rippling through the ground. He calls out corrections through the interpreter adjustments and spacing, warnings about oscillation as heavier vehicles roll across. His voice is steady, stripped of urgency by necessity. A shell lands close enough to spray the bridge with debris. Steel rattles. Men duck. The engineer does not. He knows what a direct hit would do. He also knows what premature panic would do faster. The difference between survival and collapse now lies in discipline, keeping weight distributed, speed controlled, movement continuous. The bridge becomes a lifeline in the most literal sense. On one side lies the stalled advance, compressed and vulnerable. On the other, a narrow foothold bought with risk and restraint. Every vehicle that crosses widens that foothold, reducing the bridge's singular importance even as it remains the only artery feeding momentum forward. Artillery continues to range. Some shells fall dangerously close, others drift away. The gunners are adjusting under pressure, but they are running out of time. American armor is already spreading on the far bank, pushing outward, forcing the enemy to divide attention between the crossing and the growing threat beyond it. For the men still crossing, the experience is compressed into sound and motion. Engines roar louder than normal. Drivers focus straight ahead, forbidden to stop. Infantry jog across steel slick with moisture, boots clanging in uneven rhythm. No one looks down. The river beneath feels closer now, as if aware of its role in this moment. The engineer's usefulness reaches its final intensity here. Every instruction he gives is immediate, practical, and final. There is no more planning, only correction. He has become, briefly, a component of the bridge itself, a source of stability amid shock. When the last major armored element clears the span, his role diminishes in an instant. The Americans break through. On the far bank, units push forward aggressively, using the crossing as a hinge rather than a bottleneck. Enemy artillery begins to shift fire away from the bridge toward the advancing armor, conceding the crossing even as it contests the ground beyond. The window has closed. The river has failed to hold. Gradually, the fire slackens, not because the danger has passed, but because the priority has changed. The bridge, battered but intact, has done its work. It has delivered enough force across the river to render its own destruction irrelevant. Men finally allow themselves to move away from the structure. Engineers step back, exhausted, ears ringing. Guards pull the German engineer farther from the span. His contribution complete, he does not resist. He watches the last vehicles cross with the same quiet focus he has maintained since the first warning was given. The river flows on, unchanged by shell fire or steel. The bridge stands, scarred and trembling, but unbroken. It has endured not because it was invulnerable, but because it was understood. And as the sound of battle shifts decisively beyond the far bank, one reality settles over the crossing with unmistakable clarity. This bridge was never just a means of advance. It was the moment the war demanded commitment and received it without hesitation. Once the bridge is secured and the flow of men and machines becomes continuous, the character of the battle changes with startling speed. What had been a narrow, vulnerable crossing turns into an artery of movement. Armor pours across, followed by infantry and artillery, then supply columns that transform momentum into permanence. The river, which had promised delay, now delivers acceleration. The advance on the far bank fans outward almost immediately. Units pivot instead of pushing straight ahead, using the crossing as a hinge rather than a funnel. Roads that would have been contested hours later are taken before defenses can fully organize. German formations, already strained by retreat, find themselves compressed from unexpected directions. The bridge has not simply enabled movement, it has rewritten the geometry of the fight. Encirclement follows faster than intelligence estimates predicted. Enemy units that expected time to regroup instead encounter pressure from multiple axes. Communications fracture. Withdrawal routes close before they are fully recognized as endangered. What might have become a drawn-out series of engagements collapses into pockets of resistance that cannot support one another. The difference is not courage or firepower. It is timing. Casualties reflect this shift immediately. American losses, expected to rise sharply during a forced crossing and subsequent breakout, remain lower than projected. German casualties are similarly reduced not because resistance disappears, but because collapse comes sooner. Surrenders occur where last stands had been anticipated. Men drop weapons, not out of cowardice, but out of recognition that the moment for meaningful resistance has passed. This outcome is studied later through maps and reports, traced backward to orders and maneuvers. What is not visible in those documents is the quiet cooperation that made the speed possible, the calculations that prevented collapse, the reinforcements added at the last moment, the warnings given and heeded. None of it appears in after-action summaries, because none of it fits comfortably within them. The cooperation remains unofficial, unrecorded by design. No commander wants to test the boundaries of law or precedent after the fact. What was necessary in the moment becomes inconvenient in retrospect. The war has rules, and victories are expected to conform to them cleanly. This one does not. It exists in the margins, supported by decisions that are easier to justify privately than publicly. The German engineer is returned to captivity once his usefulness ends. He is processed like any other prisoner, searched, documented, moved along. There is no special treatment, no acknowledgement, beyond a final glance back at the bridge as he is led away. His role in what followed will not be mentioned in reports, and he will not be asked to explain it. History will not require his testimony. No medals are issued for the decision that made the crossing possible. Decorations follow bravery under fire, not restraint under pressure. They reward visible acts, not invisible judgments. The engineers who listened, rather than insisted, returned to their units with no sense of unfinished business. The job was done. That is enough. The bridge itself remains for a time, carrying traffic until a more permanent structure replaces it. Eventually, it is dismantled or destroyed, its materials reused elsewhere, its significance fading as the front moves on. Soldiers who crossed it will remember it only as one more river among many, one more obstacle overcome on the road east. The war does not pause to reflect. It never does. Within days, attention shifts to the next resistance line, the next city, the next calculation of loss and gain. The river recedes into operational memory, marked perhaps by a symbol on a map, stripped of the human complexity that once surrounded it. Yet the consequences endure quietly. Lives not lost because speed replaced delay. Units not shattered because encirclement arrived early rather than late. A decision made without certainty, guided by listening rather than authority, ripples outward into an outcome no one had formally planned. This victory is not claimed as innovation or doctrine. It is absorbed, unexamined, into the momentum of success. The war prefers clean narratives, force applied, resistance broken. It has little patience for moments where the enemy's knowledge altered the result. And so the bridge becomes what most wartime achievements become, a solved problem. It did its work and disappeared. The men who built it, crossed it, and trusted it move on, carrying with them only fragments of the moment when belief bent just enough to let understanding through. Because in the end, this victory was never about the bridge alone. It was about the willingness to abandon certainty when certainty no longer fit reality. And that, more than steel or strategy, is why the war moved forward here without fanfare, without recognition, and without a name anyone would remember. For several weeks after the crossing, the bridge remains in place. It carries the steady traffic of an army moving east, trucks heavy with fuel and ammunition, ambulances heading back with the wounded artillery pieces rolling forward to new firing positions. It is no longer watched with anxiety. It has become infrastructure, absorbed into routine, its extraordinary origin already fading beneath repetition. Then, quietly, it is dismantled. A more permanent crossing replaces it, built according to doctrine, documented and measured, its existence justified by manuals rather than necessity. The temporary structure is reduced to components again, its steel reclaimed, its memory unmarked. Nothing about its removal suggests it once held an army's momentum in suspension. The German engineer is moved into a prisoner of war camp with thousands of others. He is processed, numbered, assigned a place among men whose war ended not with decisions, but with exhaustion. There is no mention of the bridge in his records, no note of the days spent under guard at the riverbank. His skills, once decisive, are now irrelevant. Like so many others, he becomes a footnote without text. What he did is never formally recorded. There is no report to file it under, no category that would comfortably contain it. It does not fit the structure of commendation or reprimand. It sits outside the war's administrative language, and so it disappears from it. History, as written, has no place for unofficial necessity. Among American engineers, however, the memory lingers, not as a story often told, but as a reference quietly shared, a look exchanged, a brief remark when doctrine proves insufficient in later crossings. They remember not the man himself, but the moment when certainty failed and listening succeeded. It becomes part of their professional instinct, though never part of their training. Doctrine remains unchanged. Manuals are revised, but not for this. The war's institutions prefer lessons that can be standardized, repeated, controlled. What happened at the river resists that treatment. It depended on context, restraint, and trust applied carefully under pressure. Those are not qualities easily reduced to procedure. The war ends soon after. Germany collapses not with a single event, but with a sequence of surrenders, encirclements, and realizations that resistance no longer alters the outcome. Cities fall, armies disband, the front dissolves into occupation zones and checkpoints. The bridge is already gone by then, its purpose fulfilled and forgotten. Peace arrives unevenly. For some, it comes with relief. For others, with loss, sharpened by survival. The men who cross the river return home carrying memories that do not align neatly with victory parades or speeches. They remember moments where the war asked something quieter of them, judgment instead of aggression, humility instead of confidence. The river flows on, unchanged by what passed over it. The banks recover. The scars fade. Nothing in the landscape marks the place where belief bent and consequence followed. If someone stands there later, they will see only water moving toward the sea, unaware of the moment it briefly held an army still. Yet the moral residue remains, even without recognition. A reminder that wars are not decided solely by firepower or plans, but by choices made when rules no longer offer clear answers. That sometimes, survival depends not on rejecting the enemy absolutely, but on understanding him precisely. After the river, the war moved on. After the war, peace arrived imperfectly. And between those two truths lies a moment that history did not record, but lives quietly in the space between doctrine and humanity, where the outcome turned not on force, but on listening. Official histories prefer clarity. They chart advances by dates and arrows, victories by units committed and ground taken. Battles receive names, commanders receive credit, bridges rarely do. They are treated as background functional necessities rather than decisive actors. In the record books, rivers are crossed, fronts advance, and the war moves on, untroubled by how narrowly momentum was preserved at certain points. Cooperation across enemy lines is especially inconvenient for this kind of accounting. It disrupts the clean division between sides, blurs the moral geometry on which wartime narratives depend. An enemy who contributes to success does not fit comfortably into categories of hero or villain. It raises questions that official histories are not designed to answer, and so they are often left unasked. Yet the outcome remains measurable. Lives spared because delay was avoided. Units not shattered because encirclement came early rather than late. Casualties that never appear in reports because they never occurred. These are negative spaces in the historical record effects, defined by absence rather than presence. They cannot be photographed or commemorated easily, but they are real, all the same. The event at the river challenges simplified morality without overturning it. It does not suggest equivalence of cause or erase responsibility for the war itself. It does something quieter. It reveals that within the machinery of conflict, human judgment still matters and sometimes alters outcomes in ways no doctrine anticipates. Good and evil remain, but they move through individuals rather than abstractions. War, in this light, is exposed as a system made of people. People who follow orders, but also interpret them. People who carry beliefs, but must adapt when belief no longer matches reality. Systems give structure, but they do not decide moments like the one at the river. Decisions do, often small ones, made under pressure by individuals whose names never appear in summaries. Even enemies, it turns out, can share purpose under extreme conditions. Not purpose in ideology or allegiance or future vision, but purpose in the immediate task of preventing collapse. Steel must hold. Weight must be managed. Time must be used wisely. In those moments, nationality recedes just enough to allow function to prevail. This is not a sentimental truth. It offers no comfort beyond recognition. The war remains brutal, unforgiving, and unjust in its costs. Cooperation here does not redeem the conflict or soften its meaning. It simply reveals that within even the most rigid structures of hostility, there are moments when survival depends on recognizing competence rather than allegiance. History rarely pauses to acknowledge such moments. They complicate the story too much. They resist slogans and refuse to stay within assigned boundaries. They suggest that outcomes are shaped not only by power and planning, but by humility, the willingness to accept help from an unexpected source when certainty begins to fail. The river crossing does not change how the war is remembered in textbooks. It does not alter the sequence of victory or defeat. But it offers a different lens, one that looks past outcomes and toward process. It asks not who won, but how success was made possible in the narrow space between rule and necessity. What the records missed was not the bridge itself, or even the cooperation that built it. What they missed was the moment when the war exposed its dependence on listening, when progress required restraint, when an enemy's knowledge mattered more than one's own assumptions. Those moments leave no monuments. They leave no citations. But they endure quietly, wherever people are forced to choose between rigid certainty and adaptive understanding. And long after the maps are redrawn and the reports filed away, it is those unseen choices that continue to shape how wars are actually won and how they might, someday, be better understood. The river is calm now. It moves at the same pace it always has, indifferent to the urgency it once imposed. Reeds bend along its banks. Water reflects the sky without distortion. Nothing in its surface suggests that it ever stopped an army, or that men once stood here, weighing hours against lives. No trace of the bridge remains. The steel is gone, repurposed or melted down. The approaches have softened back into earth. Even the scars left by artillery have faded beneath grass and seasonal floods. A passerby would find no evidence that this place once carried the weight of decision. Geography has reclaimed its anonymity. The war the bridge served has receded into archives and memory. It survives in documents, photographs, and numbers divisions moved. Cities taken, surrenders signed. It is studied now with distance, its urgency dulled by time. The river crossing occupies at most a footnote. If it appears at all, it is as a logistical detail, not a moral one. What endures instead is the contradiction. A soldier trained to stop an army helped it move forward. A man educated to build permanence for one cause used that knowledge to hasten its defeat. His actions did not arise from ideology, nor from betrayal. They emerged from a narrower space, where competence met necessity, and where refusal would have cost lives without changing the outcome. Victory here did not come from superior firepower or flawless planning. It came from restraint exercised under pressure, from the decision to listen when certainty failed, from the recognition that understanding an enemy's expertise did not weaken, resolve it, strengthened it. This does not redeem the war. It does not soften the suffering that preceded or followed it. But it complicates the story in a way worth remembering. It reminds us that even within systems designed for destruction, there are moments when humanity asserts itself quietly, without permission or applause. The men who crossed the bridge carried on with the war, and then with their lives. The engineer entered captivity, and then history's silence. None of them could know whether their moment would be remembered or misunderstood or erased altogether. In the end, it was mostly erased, and yet the truth remains intact beneath the silence. They trained him to build for one side. They trained him to calculate loads, resist forces, impose order on nature. What they could not train out of him was the instinct to prevent collapse when he saw it coming. In that moment, his loyalty shifted not to an enemy, not to a flag, but to the fragile structure holding men above water. The bridge was temporary. The decision was not. It stands as a reminder that wars are not only contests of power, but tests of judgment. That sometimes the line between enemy and ally narrows to the width of a river, and sometimes it disappears altogether under the weight of responsibility. The river flows on, carrying none of this with it, but the contradiction remains, suspended in time. That an army advanced not because it destroyed its enemy completely, but because just once it trusted him enough to listen. They laughed once, they never laughed again.